By 1944, and with the success of the island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific during World War II, Army ground and air forces helped push the Japanese military closer and closer to Japan and ultimate victory. What was the Army role in some of the major battles and victories in the Pacific from 1944 to 1945? What were the unique challenges facing the Army, and how did they overcome them? What was the plan for the attack on the Japanese homeland, and what role did the Army play in post-war Japan? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're discussing the Army's role in the Pacific from 1944 through VJ Day and the post-war Japan. Joining me for this discussion is Army historian Dr. Michael Krivdo. So welcome back, Michael.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Lee. It's my pleasure to be with you today discussing one of my favorite topics. So again, thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, my pleasure. And just so our audience knows, I'm here in Washington, D.C., and you're calling in from Hawaii, where...
That's correct.
Yeah, Dr. Michael Krivdo is the command historian for the U.S. Pacific Command there on Oahu. Previously, he served in the Marine Corps for 25 years as an infantry officer and special operations officer. Highlights of his career include regional Marine officer responsible for the internal security for all U.S. State Department embassies and consulates within the Indo-Pacific region. He authored several NATO manuals. He served as a United Nations military observer team leader and was the first U.S. Pacific Command representative to the Republic of Korea Marine Corps. After leaving active duty, he earned a doctorate in military and diplomatic history from Texas A&M, where he taught military history for 2 years until he was hired by the U.S. Special Operations Command as a civilian historian. And in addition to publishing articles, he co-authored a book for the Army University Press on special operations support to large-scale combat operations. Well, all right, Michael. Previously we talked about the Army in the Pacific, from late 1941 through 1943, and a lot about the island hopping campaigns, how those started. But as 1944 began, the Southwest Pacific was now largely under Allied control, with the Central Pacific making pretty good progress. So at this point in time, what were the strategic objectives of Allied forces in the Pacific? And what were the issues between competing leaders such as MacArthur, Admiral Nimitz, and Admiral King?
Great questions. What I'd like to do is review the strategic situation in the Pacific and some of the decisions that it impacted the 45 campaign.
Sure.
As we talked about before, if you could consider the beginning of the year, 1941 through about 1943, as our formative period, well, the years 1944 and 1945 are kind of our graduate studies where we're applying what we've learned in that early part of the war, and we're really making progress, like you just mentioned. Operations like Iceberg on Okinawa represented the advanced stage in America's long execution strategy in the Pacific. 4,000 miles of ocean and more than 3 years of war separated Okinawa from Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
In 1942 and 43, the Americans, as we mentioned, contained the enemy and stopped them. In 1944, our attack gained momentum, and a series of fierce island campaigns carried them in giant steps steadily towards the Japanese home islands. The Allied advance followed two main axes, one through the islands of the Central Pacific, the other through the South and Southwest Pacific. Navy task forces operated on both fronts as needed. Submarines firmly blockaded the Japanese islands, choking off the flow of vital resources. The result was unremitting pressure against Japanese military power, a major objective of American strategy.
Mm-hmm.
But near the close of 43, U.S. forces seized Tarawa, Macon, and Apamama in the Gilbert Islands, paving the way for taking the Marshalls in January of 44.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, American carriers attacked Truk, neutralizing that formidable enemy naval base. And in the Marianas Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell quickly to American arms in the summer of 1944. And in the First Battle of the Philippine Sea, the U.S. Navy defeated the Japanese fleet. By late 1944, Americans occupied Ulithi in the Western Carolines and were busy putting that to work as an anchorage in an advanced fleet base. And they also took Angaur and Peleliu in the Palau Islands to guard that left flank.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, American forces in the South and Southwest Pacific approached Mindanao in the southern Philippines by advances through the Solomons and New Guinea after Japanese armies were neutralized and isolated on Bougainville, New Ireland, and New Britain. The capture of Wakti in New Guinea in May 44 enabled the seizure of several other islands. But during the summer, a bypassed Japanese army attempted to break out from Wewak in Australian New Guinea and was subdued by the force. The invasion of Morotai in September of 44 saw American forces for the first time within 300 miles of Mindanao in the southern Philippines.
Yeah.
Remember, the main goal of American operations in the Pacific was to destroy the industrial heart of Japan.
Mm-hmm.
American strategy aimed to reach this objective by successive steps and to take advantage of Japan's vulnerability to submarine blockade and air bombardment. Throughout most of 1944, joint staffs in the Pacific Ocean areas had planned for the invasion of Formosa in Operation Causeway to be conducted in the spring of 1945. The general concept of that operation had been outlined and tactical units assigned. That was the plan at that time, but MacArthur had his eyes on his main prize, which was always taking back the Philippines.
Right. Well, he made that guarantee to them when he left, didn't he? I shall return.
Yes, he did. He absolutely did. I shall return, and he was dropping matchbooks and all kinds of other souvenirs all over the Philippine Islands with that little motto on there to remind the people that he hadn't forgotten about them.
And that was a big morale boost to the people and to the forces still fighting there. Yeah.
It was, and he felt that commitment because, he had told them that he was there to help defend them in 1941-42 and had not been able to carry through on his promises. So his promise was, I shall return. The arguments on whether to invade Formosa or Luzon and whether to pursue two axes of attack or only one prompted President Roosevelt himself to call a historic meeting in Hawaii with both General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz in Hawaii in July of 1944. The president traveled out to Hawaii because he wanted to meet with both leaders in person to hear their arguments for each of their positions unfiltered. During the meeting, which has no written record, which is a little bit unusual.
That is unusual.
And I think it was.
Wow.
Yes, it is. It was designed specifically for that. Only 4 people attended. MacArthur argued his case for invading Luzon, stating it would cut Japan off from vital resources. He was very adamant about it. He also believed that the U.S. had a moral responsibility to the Philippine people. Nimitz, of course, argued for a central thrust to Taiwan, bypassing Luzon, noting that Taiwan would place the Allies in a better position to strike the Japanese home islands than Luzon would. Roosevelt factored the discussions into his decisions for strategic moves within the Pacific. In September, the Joint Chiefs directed General Douglas MacArthur to seize Leyte on 20 October instead of 20 December as originally planned, and to bypass Mindanao. So, in other words, they modified it a little bit, but they did allow MacArthur to be able to go back to the Philippines
Right.
and wrestle it away from the Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, Admiral Nimitz was instructed to bypass Yap in the Caroline Islands. It was a large Japanese naval base.
Oh.
The next day, Admiral Nimitz reconsidered the Formosa operation. He believed that the early advance into the central Philippines, with the opportunity of acquiring the desired fleet anchorages,
Mm-hmm.
opened up the possibility of a direct advance to the Ryukyu and Bonin Islands rather than going through Formosa. So now they're starting to kind of come together.
Oh, yeah.
Nimitz stated the three strategic objectives of Operation Causeway, which was the establishment of air bases from which to bomb Japan, to support China in their fight, and to cut off the home islands from resources to the south, could best be achieved if they seized the Ryukyu Islands, which is Okinawa.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
So when Nimitz changed his mind on the need to invade Formosa, the Joint Staff concurred,
Mm-hmm.
and the Formosa operation was officially deferred. Instead, General MacArthur would invade Luzon, and the Pacific Ocean Area's forces would seize Iwo Jima
Mm-hmm.
in February of 1945 and the Ryukyu Islands on 1 April.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The Okinawan campaign
Mm-hmm.
was therefore linked strategically with the plans to take Luzon and Iwo Jima.
Mm-hmm.
They were calculated to maintain firm pressure against Japan and to increase the attrition of its military forces. The Luzon operation allowed the forces of General MacArthur to continue the offensive to secure the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
The occupation of Iwo Jima in February of 1945 provided a fighter support base for the B-29s operating from the Marianas and an emergency field if needed. And that emergency field was put to use even when the fighting was still going on in Iwo Jima.
Wow.
So it kind of validated the requirement.
Mm-hmm.
The seizure of Okinawa in March, which was pushed back to April, would provide the bases and support to carry the war effort to the threshold of Japan and cut the enemy's lines of communication between its resource area in the south and its still sizable Japanese forces in China and the home islands.
Right.
Because you got to remember at that time, there were still more than 1 million Japanese soldiers in China, a significant force.
Wow.
Which a lot of times people seem to forget about. You know, we never really faced the majority of the Japanese army, even when we were fighting in throughout the Pacific, because we were able to cut them into small pieces,
right?
You know, and take them bit by bit.
Yeah. And did Japan plan to pull any of those million soldiers out of China back to Japan itself for the defense of the home island?
Well, they did that from time to time. Yeah, they would have definitely have done it for the defense of the home islands. In fact, when it became apparent that we were going to go to Okinawa instead of Formosa, the Japanese shifted a combat division from mainland China into Okinawa right before the assault. So unfortunately, it kind of reinforced the already pretty well qualified and in combat experienced soldiers that were there. It reinforced them with about 70,000 combat troops at a time when we would have liked to have not had to face them.
Right. So, but we never went into Formosa, right?
No, we did not. We did not. The decision was made. You know, if we could take the Ryukyu Islands, which is Okinawa, and the outlying islands, then we can defer on invasion of Taiwan itself.
Were there any deception operations that were going on to make the Japanese think that we were still planning to go to Formosa as a way just to keep troops pinned down there?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. We still kept up a concerted bombing effort from Luzon because it's you're only a few hundred air miles from northern Luzon airfields into Formosa. So we kept pressure on the Japanese and also at the same time conducted some deception operations to try to keep them believing that we were still going to go into Formosa and possibly some portion of mainland China.
Yeah. And now, and before we move forward from Okinawa, I just want to see where in this year and a half from 44 to spring or early summer of 45, what challenges was the Army specifically facing, and were there any innovations in tactics or technology that were developed to make things better for the Army?
Yeah, those are fantastic questions here. Let's talk about those challenges. Like I said before, 4,000 miles in 3 years of time separated the campaigns of 45 from Pearl Harbor in 1941. Mm-hmm. The deeper we got into the Pacific and the closer that we got to Japan, obviously, the more complicated things became. By 1945, the planning and execution of the battles at Okinawa and Iwo Jima presented logistical problems of a magnitude greater than any previously encountered in World War II. Now, for example, for the assault echelon of Okinawa alone, which is about 183,000 troops and 750,000 measurement tons of cargo, they had to be loaded into over 430 assault transports and landing ships at 11 different ports scattered from Seattle, Washington, all the way to Leyte. A huge expanse of over 6,000 miles. So if you can imagine, the coordination effort that's involved to be able to do that, to make sure that you got everything that you need to go across the beach in Okinawa. Sure. Wow. So you're dealing with all of these distances and complexities that up until this stage of the war, nobody had to deal with. Equipment maintenance also had to be provided for the combat troops. So you had to think about that and plan accordingly. And also a growing garrison force that eventually numbered over 250,000 troops. Wow. This is 250,000 troops on top of the ones that you need to go across the beach. That's just to be able to protect your rear areas.
Right.
Support troops, garrison force.
Right. Now I know the Army had 22 divisions in the Pacific throughout World War II. But for all these logistical support elements, were they part of those divisions, or is that additional forces?
That's additional forces on top of all that. These are Army support organizations that would come in to garrison some of these islands. Now, we had learned early in the war, because to maintain the sea lines of communication, which we talked about in the last podcast, between the west coast of the United States and Australia, I did a tally here for our staff, and we came up with a figure just from the units that I could identify that we had between 400,000 and 500,000 troops just maintaining the string of islands to protect that sea line of communication. This is over and above everything that you've already got out there to actually get into the trenches and go to toe-to-toe combat with the Japanese.
Yeah. Now,
so that's something that a lot of people forget about.
Yeah, and was this also supporting the Marine Corps? I mean, the Marines had 6 divisions, I think, to our 22, but did they also have their own separate logistics line of communication, or was it all, all together?
Well, it's good that you mentioned there are 6 divisions, because the support responsibilities for those 6 divisions basically fall on the Navy and the Army to be able to provide them with the support that they need, because they don't have their own internal support for medical, hospitals, dentists. I mean, all the things that they depend upon the Navy for today, they depended upon the Navy or the Army to provide them during World War II.
Yeah, and I find this also fascinating because, growing up, I'm not a historian. As they say, I'm a history enthusiast. But, I, like so many other people, think of World War II as, well, Army is Europe, Marine Corps is Pacific. But
yes, I run across that every single day in my job.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to remind people all the time that it was an integrated fight.
Yeah.
That Army units fought on, for the most part, under Army command, but also under the support of the Army.
Right.
And, fought side by side, all the way across all the islands from Guadalcanal to the bitter end there in Okinawa.
Yeah, I mean, the Army had such so much more of a larger role and footprint in the Pacific than I had realized.
Right, it's the enabling force. It's the theater army is making sure that all of those people are fed. They're all taken care of. They all have medical care. They all have radios, batteries, all the stuff that they need to be able to get into combat, plus ammunition, weapons, the repair for all of those things. All of that falls on either the Army or the Navy.
Yeah.
Able to do that. In addition to providing it for our own troops.
And as I mentioned earlier, we had MacArthur, we had Admiral Nimitz, and then Admiral King. Were there any? Because MacArthur was MacArthur, so
right. Yeah.
The American Caesar, I think he was referred to in a book, but.
Absolutely, and very, and that's a very accurate description too.
So those three personalities were. How much of that came into play when it came to directing the war effort in the Pacific?
Well, as we just discussed, when it came time to decide on some of the major objectives, there were some disagreements.
Yeah,
MacArthur thought that he should be at the pointy end of the spear. Just everybody would support his efforts, and he'll drive all the way through to Japan and get everything done.
Right.
So unfortunately, they decided on a two-axis approach, with MacArthur doing his axis from Southwest Pacific area, and Nimitz doing the drive across the Central Pacific, which I think is in the long run certainly proved out to be a better approach. You could say that you could concentrate the forces, but as we've seen, the logistic effort there, we just could not do it. But you could alternate your support between those two axes and still maintain momentum of all your combat forces.
Right. Well, so far we've talked a lot about the sea and the land, but another big part of this battle was the Army Air Forces. And
it is.
So can you talk a little bit in terms of what was their strategy and tactics, and what were some of the significant activities or milestones that they accomplished?
Sure. Yeah, in general, they worked to put themselves in position to conduct preliminary air and naval operations against the enemy to ensure control of the air during ground combat operations, as well as protecting the forces by neutralizing strong enemy enclaves like that in the Japanese base at Rabaul or at Turk. Those are huge bases that we decided to just bypass.
Wow.
And go around and let them die on the vine, basically.
Yeah.
To pin them down, cause attrition, and to isolate them, and most importantly, to prevent their ability to reinforce any of the forward base locations. Part of what made the battle in Guadalcanal, which was both an Army and a Marine Corps battle, as well as Navy participation, is the fact that the Japanese, it took us a while to learn that we needed to isolate the objective area, the operations area, to keep the Japanese from reinforcing the troops. Because all they did was they just kept slipping more and more troops in there. And we find ourselves always facing, all of a sudden a new pocket of enemy that we didn't know that was there before. So by being able to bypass some of these areas and isolate them and prevent their ability to reinforce those forward bases, this, of course, requires close cooperation between often distant and dispersed bases, as the air forces also leapfrogged their air bases to maintain coverage of the widely dispersed forces in the ground and as we move forward. So they would need to also plan and coordinate their movements in synchronization with the ground forces to make sure that they, could provide them with adequate cover to their front and help them attrit the enemy and isolate the objective areas.
And in this, are we seeing a lot of work between the ground forces and the air? What we call today close air support. Was a lot of that developed and worked out during this time period?
Yeah, it is actually. That's when we're starting to develop those techniques very closely, and more importantly, going back, sending duty experts back to the States to be able to tell the brand new pilots in our schools how to do close air support.
Right.
But also, for example, the isolation of Okinawa was to be accomplished with land-based air forces located outside the Pacific Ocean area in a well-coordinated plan. The planes from the Southwest Pacific area, in other words, MacArthur's forces, would engage in searches and continuous strikes against Formosa as part of that deception plan, and then shifting to Okinawa as soon as the situation in Luzon permitted. What that means is that you're supporting an attack in Okinawa from air bases in northern Philippines.
Okay.
As you can imagine, the coordination required to do something like that, and make sure that you're not committing fratricide and shooting down your own planes.
Right. Yeah.
And also being able to protect them and provide sea air rescue services and other things like that. Also, we had the 20th Air Force B-29s from China and the Marianas Islands that continued to bomb Formosa, Kyushu, and Okinawa during the month preceding the landings. So the China-based 20th Bomber Command essentially started shifting its fires to concentrate on Formosa, while the 21st Bomber Command from the Marianas initially attacked Okinawa and then shifted to the Kyushu on the Japanese mainland and other vulnerable points while the fighting on Okinawa was going on.
Yeah.
In other words, providing that forward coverage beyond the immediate battle area to help isolate it and keep the Japanese from interfering with what we're trying to do on Okinawa.
And at what point was Okinawa considered secured? What point in time?
What point was it secured?
Yeah.
Well, it took them 81 days.
Oh,
to
wow.
secure the island. They went in April 1st, or April Fool's Day. It was also Easter Sunday at that time. And actually, it took them about twice as long to secure the island as what they had originally planned, because they faced a enemy that had changed tactics on them and decided not to fight on the beaches, but instead from well-constructed, well-coordinated, advanced fighting positions that interlocking fields of fire and all of the tactical measures that were put in place to be able to keep them fighting and attriting the friendly forces. They changed their tactics on us finally.
Yeah. So they really had to. The Army, the U.S. Army, then had to really adapt and
adapt on the fly.
Yeah. Was that a bigger challenge than they expected?
It was, especially because some of the other strange characteristics of Okinawa. Basically, Okinawa was just another larger version of Iwo Jima. Even though it was not, actively volcanic at the time, it was still you have a countryside that's formed out of volcanic rock with lots of caves and lots of ways that the Japanese could reinforce their front positions with overhead cover and so forth to be able to get behind us to attack from the flanks in strength, and all of a sudden appear out of nowhere. So we had to change our tactics and learn, switch from how we had been fighting them on the relatively smaller islands of the Marianas and some of the other places, and learn how to do it when a Japanese army was standing up to you with tanks and artillery and and slugging it out as a large-scale ground combat operation.
Wow, yeah, almost reflecting what was going on in Europe at the time. Well, Europe was over by then, but before VE Day, yeah. Okay.
Right, and if we could discuss Iwo Jima briefly.
The
please. Battle that we had talked about it, a battle that most people believe to be fought by the U.S. Marine Corps exclusively. Although 3 Marine Corps divisions made up most of the forces, there was Army participation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Let's spend a minute discussing an unusual Army regiment that spent most of World War II not with the Army, but with the Marine Corps.
Oh, okay.
The unit in question was the Ohio National Guard, 147th Infantry Regiment, a very unique unit that spent the entire war fighting not alongside fellow Army soldiers, but instead with U.S. Marine Corps assault elements in some of the deadliest operations of the war in the Pacific. They earned a reputation as the Army's lost regiment. When activated as part of the 37th Division in early 1942, the Buckeye Division was dispatched to the Pacific and reorganized like many of the divisions were, from a World War I style rectangular structure to a modern triangular division organization. Now, in that process, they lost a regiment. In other words, they went from 4 regiments to 3.
Oh, okay.
So the spare regiment, which just happened to be the 147th, now without a divisional home, was then assigned to duties with the U.S. Marine Corps.
Mm-hmm.
It served first on Guadalcanal, then in New Guinea, Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima, and finally on Okinawa.
Mm-hmm.
And basically what they did was they helped provide some combat support and extra firepower to the Marine Corps.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, the 147th landed on Iwo Jima on 21 March, ostensibly to perform mopping up duty.
Oh, yeah.
Although they made estimates at the time that there were only 300 Japanese left on Iwo Jima, those numbers were grossly in error.
Oh.
The 140th refined 3 types of actions to clear large numbers of holdouts: ambush patrols, combat patrols, and cave clearing, which is really comes into play in Iwo Jima and later on in Okinawa.
Mm-hmm.
What they did was they refined their techniques for clearing the hellish caves, adopting the nickname of cavemen.
Oh, wow. Almost like the tunnel rats, from Vietnam. Yeah, same concept.
Yeah, it's like the tunnels of Cu Chi.
Yes.
Yeah, you're exactly right. They refine these tactics and techniques and learn the best way to adapt to the enemy and get in there and clear them out. For the 3 months that they fought on Iwo Jima, which was twice as long as any Marine unit was there, the 147th killed or captured 2,469 enemy soldiers.
Wow.
With some sources claiming as many as 6,000 enemy were sealed into caves. So the numbers of only 300 guys being left were really way off.
Oh, my gosh. Wow.
Yeah, so they were involved in some pretty heavy combat for the 3 months that they were there.
Yeah, I didn't know about them, but I think we also had like supply Army supply elements at Iwo Jima as well, right? So it wasn't just these combat.
You do supply. Yeah. You have some supply people. You got an anti-tank company, a cannon company, 2 amphib tractor battalions, 5 squadrons of Army aviators with their ground crews. A number of medical personnel, and even a field hospital that accompanied the Marines ashore.
And that's all
These
Army.
are thousands, thousands of Army troops.
Yeah.
And they estimate that probably 1/3 of all the amphibious tractors that took the Marines ashore were driven by soldiers.
Oh, wow.
So a pretty significant role.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
from a unit that went largely unknown and unrecognized.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up. In fact, I'm going to look more into that myself, do a little bit more research.
Yeah.
You've piqued my interest, so I'm going to definitely look it up. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting organization. It's about the same response I had when I briefed it to our staff up here.
Yeah.
It's one of my little briefs that I do from time to time.
Yeah. No, it's great, and this is why we do these podcasts and staff rides and things like that here in the Army. This is history that a lot of people don't know, and so I'm glad you're bringing this to the forefront. But Michael, I think we need to pivot back to Okinawa, securing Okinawa, and then what's next, right? The plans for the invasion of the home islands of Japan. Can you kind of talk about what was the plan to go into Japan?
Well, of course, the price that was paid for Okinawa was dear. It shocked our leadership. The final toll of American casualties was the highest experience in any campaign against the Japanese. Total American battle casualties over 50,000 from that one campaign alone, from which about 1/3 were killed or missing and 2/3 wounded. Army losses, there were about 5,000 killed, 93 missing, and 18,000 wounded.
Wow.
Ship losses were high, most of them because of kamikaze air action.
Oh, yeah.
Essentially, almost 800 aircraft were lost during the Battle of Okinawa alone. The high cost was due in part, as we mentioned, that the battle had been fought against a capably led Japanese army of greater strength than anticipated over difficult terrain that was heavily and expertly fortified. The campaign had lasted considerably longer than expected, but Americans had demonstrated again on Okinawa that they could ultimately wrest from the Japanese whatever ground they wanted. The cost to the Japanese was even higher, over 100,000 killed. 91% of all Japanese who were Japanese combatants that were on the island were killed.
Wow. But wasn't that typical? From things that I've read, wasn't that like the typical for the Japanese that they would fight to the death and
yes,
we didn't get a lot of
prisoners.
Yeah.
It became even more ferocious the closer we got to the Japanese homeland.
Oh yeah.
The defenders, they in captured documents and intercepted radio transmissions, knew full well that this was a rehearsal for invading the main islands, and they knew they all they needed to do was to make this as costly as possible, and maybe we would come to a negotiated settlement.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, the terrible cost of seizing Okinawa did influence top-level planning for the upcoming invasion of Japan, which was scheduled to begin 1 November of 1945. It was supposed to be led by an amphibious assault from the U.S. Sixth Army on southern Kyushu. Admiral Nimitz, who had favored the invasion plans in late April, changed his position a month later because of the soaring Okinawa losses. Intelligence reports of the thousands of kamikaze planes and suicide boats that were being assembled for the defense of the Japanese main island.
And boats. Wow. Yeah, I think that's the first time I've heard of like kamikaze boats.
Yeah, we faced those for the first time. We were lucky in the Battle of Okinawa. The 77th Division, 3 days before the assault, seized the Kurama Islands, just close to mainland Okinawa, and destroyed 350 suicide boats that would have been in the perfect location to destroy the transports. So they basically prevented what could have been a disastrous loss of many of our transports. Yeah, they used them quite heavily. They were into that at that time. That's how desperate they were.
Yeah.
In June, President Truman, brand new President Truman, because he just took over in the death of FDR, concluded a special briefing on a proposed Kyushu landing by the Joint Chiefs of Staff with the declaration that he wanted to prevent another Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other.
Yeah.
In other words, just horrific losses. Importantly, the Okinawan experience shaped the American vision of what to expect in an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Plans were already in development for a late 1945 invasion of the southern Japanese islands, Operation Downfall. On execution, Operation Downfall would have been 4 times the size of Operation Iceberg in Okinawa.
Yeah.
It would have had more than 30 infantry and armored divisions that were force listed for the invasion.
Wow.
The remainder was being shipped over from Europe. Tens of thousands of planes and virtually every ship in the combined naval Allied fleets would support the plan.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Detailed plans called for the first invasion of the southern Japanese islands in November 1945, only 4 months after Okinawa.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, though, the sequel to Okinawa was contrary to all expectations.
Yeah.
Amid feverish combat preparations on 6 August 1945, with the day for the assault on Kyushu drawing close, became the unbelievable and joyous news that the war was over.
Mm-hmm.
The 1-2 punch of the employment of atomic weapons and the declaration of war by the Soviet Union forced the Japanese military to finally relinquish their control of the government and surrender.
Right.
As a result, the Battle of Okinawa became the last combat operation of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Overnight, Operation Downfall, or the invasion, was shelved, and a branch plan, Operation Blacklist, called instead for the occupation of Japan in only 2 weeks.
Wow.
World War II was over.
Yeah.
Now, Blacklist was essentially, I mean, this caught everybody by surprise.
Yeah.
You know, they did not put a whole lot of planning. When they're facing these horrific possible casualties, they didn't put a whole lot of planning in the occupation. They put most of the planning work into the invasion.
Right, right.
And now, all of a sudden, having to change in just a matter of weeks, it kind of caught everybody by surprise.
Mm-hmm.
So what they did was they just modified the same plan, the same units.
Oh, okay.
That were earmarked to go to certain parts of Japan to invade it. Instead, they would go to the same areas because they had been studying those areas.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Except they would change the mission to occupation,
right,
and not combat.
And what was their primary goal? Was it to demilitarize the country first, or what were the objectives?
Yeah, first. Even though the primary military goal was to demilitarize
by force
the Japanese military, basically take all the weapons out of their hands,
right?
And but they found themselves with humanitarian issues.
Okay.
Because the Japanese population were starving to death.
Mm-hmm.
Our blockades were working, and slowly but surely, we had pushed them into some real dire straits to where they couldn't provide enough food to live.
Oh, wow.
And so we found ourselves having to do humanitarian missions after we disarmed the Japanese military.
Right. Yeah, and then after the humanitarian missions, we stayed. How long did we remain as an occupying force?
Well into the Korean War. I think it was the May Day of 1952, maybe right off the top of my head.
Yeah.
That we transitioned from an occupying force to giving the reins fully to the Japanese and remaining there as a garrison force.
Right. And we remain there today. Yeah.
We remain there today because of the strategic situation and the fact that the Japanese islands and our agreements with Japan is one of the 5 treaty countries that we have out here in the Pacific.
Okay. Yeah.
We've got a treaty with Japan, Philippines, Korea, and Thailand. It's one of our oldest treaty partners out here.
Right.
Australia.
And how long did it take for the Japanese people to start looking at the occupiers, the American occupiers, or Allied occupiers too, as people that were there, as friends, as opposed to you're my enemy, I can't trust you? And when did that all change?
Well, actually, they made that transition pretty quickly because the Japanese people culturally were they were taught to respect the authority.
Oh.
And the new authority was now the United States. And so they made that transition fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, many of the Americans who went there as occupation force were pleasantly surprised that they were not facing a largely hostile population,
Right.
which was certainly what they were expecting.
Yeah, no insurgency as something we've
No insurgency
come to know
for the
about
most part.
recently. Yeah. Oh.
There were some isolated
Mm-hmm.
incidents here and there, and there were some Japanese units who said that they didn't get the word to disarm. So,
Right.
but they were quickly
Mm-hmm.
disarmed, and we made plans for demilitarization
Right.
of the Korean Peninsula and some other locations,
And,
and then also transporting them out
mm-hmm.
of China as fast
Oh,
as
yeah.
we could too, dismantling that force that was there.
Right, and then just as in Germany, we had the Nuremberg trials. There were war trials in Japan. Is there
There were.
anything specific to note about those?
Well, there were, but they were. I think that most students of the war crimes of the Japanese would agree with the fact that the Japanese largely got a pass,
Mm-hmm.
as in comparison with what we did over in Germany.
Right.
And part of that was because of the rationalization and the ideas of General MacArthur,
Mm-hmm.
who was the supreme commander for the Allies in the Pacific. So he was the head individual who was in charge of the occupation and made all the rules.
Mm-hmm.
And he decided early on that if the sticking point was, because many people wanted to hang the emperor.
Yeah, right.
And so he basically forbid that. In fact, gave the emperor a pardon, and then became instrumental in rewriting Japanese laws
Mm-hmm.
to change Japanese culture rather significantly. There's some interesting books. I can't remember the author who wrote a book called MacArthur's Children, which talks about his influence over that occupation period. And that kind of aptly describes the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
He was very paternal
Mm-hmm.
in his relations with the Japanese, and considered them his responsibility. And he felt that he needed to change their
Mm-hmm.
culture of war, and did so.
Right.
The Japanese, of course, adopted a constitution
Mm-hmm.
which forbids them ever conducting an offensive war.
Yeah. What a huge cultural shift for the Japanese.
It is. It was amazing, the
Mm-hmm.
cultural shift. And
Yeah.
that, and he also wrote into Japanese law many different laws and regulations and changes in culture that still exist today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In their own constitution later on.
Right.
Here it is, 80 years on.
Yeah. Yeah, and it still holds up. Well.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And they're one of our most steadfast
allies,
partners out here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Well, Michael, we need to start wrapping this up, but before we close, it's time for our segment called Hua Trivia. So, is there some piece of trivia that you can share about the Army in the Pacific from World War II?
Absolutely. I've been waiting for this for a little while. We just talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
We just talked about it in our recent our commanders conference that we held here at USERPAC early last month. Our U.S. Army Pacific shoulder sleeve insignia is very unusual in that regard. If you look at it, the design is distinct. It's different than many shoulder sleeve insignias. Now, a lot of units would say that, but if you even look at it, it's round. It's not, it doesn't look like that you would expect from the 101st or the 82nd or something along those lines. It was approved in 1944 during the time frame that we've been talking about, when everybody is focused on Japan and the axis that you're trying to carve to Japan to defeat them in combat.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a unique insignia that reflects the times that it was created. Then much of the theater planning and coordination took place in USARPAC headquarters at Fort Shafter, only 4 miles from Pearl Harbor.
Oh, wow.
So Pearl Harbor permeates everything.
Mm-hmm.
For those that aren't familiar with it, it's a blue disc that represents the vastness of the Pacific Ocean.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Superimposed is a red arrow raised on white that represents both the Central Pacific Drive that was then underway,
mm-hmm.
as well as the unsupported might of the theater army in that drive towards Japan.
Mm.
Above it are 12 stars arranged in constellations. The angle of the single solitary North Star, Polaris, which is critical in finding location, if you use the Latin long system,
mm-hmm.
represents the location of the latitude of Hawaii.
Oh, okay. Oh, smart. Wow.
Above it
wow.
are 7 stars of the Big Dipper, which
mm-hmm.
are readily visible in the northern hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
In the southern part, or the lower part of the insignia, are the distinctive 4 stars of the Southern Cross that's
mm-hmm.
visible in the southern hemisphere.
Right.
So you can see it shows the stars of both the north and
mm-hmm.
the south.
Yeah.
When you arrange those star numbers, you get a critical historical date, 12/7/41.
Oh,
or
wow.
December 7th, 1941, the day of the Pearl Harbor attack,
Oh.
a day that will live in infamy.
Wow.
And on that note, I'll let it go, and thank you very much.
That's fascinating.
For,
thank you.
Yeah, the opportunity to be able to talk about, again, one of my favorite subjects.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. Thank you so much for all of your insights today about the Army in the Pacific Theater for the last 2 years of World War II and then into post-war Japan. Well, if anyone wants to learn more about the Army in World War II or learn more about Army history in general, then I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit us on social media. We're on Facebook, X, and Instagram. So thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds. And until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.